The Apache girl whispered, "Don't untie this cloth." Man alone pulled the knot and froze at what he saw. The blood had already dried black on the desert floor when Ezekiel Thorne found her. She sat perfectly still against the red sandstone outcropping, her dark hair catching the late afternoon sun that filtered through the canyon walls. Her hands were pressed against something wrapped in faded blue cloth, holding it against her chest like a precious thing, or a dangerous one. Thorne had been tracking the Comancheros for 3 days through the Chihuahuan Desert, following their trail of destruction across the New Mexico territory. The bounty on their leader, Santos Morales, would feed him through winter and maybe buy him passage back to civilization. But the raiders had vanished into the labyrinth of canyons near Apache Pass, and now he found something else entirely. The girl couldn't be more than 20 summers. Apache, by the cut of her buckskin dress and the silver jewelry at her throat. Her face was streaked with dust and something darker. Tears, maybe, or blood. She didn't move when his horse's hooves scraped against the stone, didn't even look up when his shadow fell across her. Thorne dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. The Apache were not known for their patience with white men, especially not armed ones who stumbled into their sacred places. But this canyon felt wrong, too quiet, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The girl's eyes finally lifted to meet his. They were the color of obsidian, black and sharp enough to cut glass. There was pain there, and something else. Fear, but not of him. Fear of whatever she held wrapped in that cloth. She spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, her English careful and precise. "You should not be here, white man." Thorne had heard Apache women speak before, during his years as a cavalry scout. Their voices carried the rhythm of their native tongue, even when they spoke English, musical and flowing like water over stones. But this girl's words came out flat and careful, as if she was concentrating on each syllable. He gestured toward the bundle in her arms. "What happened here?" The girl's grip tightened on the cloth. "Nothing that concerns you." But Thorne had eyes. The canyon floor told a story written in boot prints and horse tracks, in scattered brass cartridges and dark stains on the rock. A fight had happened here, and recently. The metallic smell of blood still hung in the desert air, mixing with the scent of sage and creosote. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Temperance, snorted and pawed at the ground. Animals could sense things men couldn't, and Temperance had been nervous since they entered the canyon. Her ears swiveled constantly, listening for threats that might not even be there. The girl noticed his attention on the mare. "Your horse has wisdom. She knows this place is cursed now." "Cursed how?" The girl's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "My people have words for things yours do not understand. Some knowledge is meant to stay buried." Thorne studied her face. The Apache were master storytellers, but they were also practical people. They didn't speak of curses lightly, didn't waste words on superstition when survival was always balanced on a knife's edge. If this girl believed something was cursed, there was a reason. The shadows in the canyon were growing longer. Soon it would be dark, and the desert at night was no place for a lone woman, Apache or otherwise. But something in her posture told him she had no intention of leaving. "You planning to sit here until you die?" Thorne asked. The girl's obsidian eyes flashed. "Better than carrying this burden to my people." She shifted slightly, and the cloth bundle made a sound. Not quite a rattle, not quite a whisper. Like dried leaves brushing against each other, or like old bones settling in a grave. Thorne felt the hair on his neck stand up. "What's in the bundle?" The girl looked down at the cloth, then back at him. For a moment, something like vulnerability flickered across her features. "My grandmother always said that some gifts come with prices too high to pay. She warned me about curiosity, about the danger of wanting to see things that were meant to stay hidden." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was the wisest woman in our band. Medicine woman, keeper of the old stories, the old ways. She died 3 moons ago, and with her death, certain responsibilities fell to me." The girl paused as if weighing her words. There are things in this world that should not exist, white man. Things that were made in anger or desperation. Things that carry the weight of old wounds and older hatreds. My grandmother kept such things safe, kept them from doing harm. Thorn waited. The Apache way of speaking was like their way of hunting, patient, deliberate, with every word carefully chosen. To interrupt would be worse than rude. It would mark him as a fool. When she died, I inherited her medicine bundle. But not just the healing herbs and sacred stones. I inherited the dangerous things too. The things that were too powerful to destroy but too dangerous to use. The cloth bundle shifted again in her arms. This time, Thorn was sure he heard something like a whisper, though the canyon was empty except for the two of them. The girl noticed his reaction. You hear it too. I hear something. Then you understand why I cannot return to my people. This thing. She looked down at the bundle with something approaching revulsion. It should have been buried with my grandmother, but the Comancheros came during the burial rites. They scattered our camp, killed the elders who knew the proper ceremonies. In the chaos, I grabbed what I could and ran. The pieces began to fall into place. The tracks in the canyon, the smell of blood, the girl's fear. The Comancheros followed you here. 3 of them. They thought an Apache woman alone would be easy prey. They thought wrong, but she gestured toward dark stains on the canyon walls. Fighting them required me to unwrap this thing, to use its power. And now it has tasted blood again. Thorn's hand instinctively moved toward his Colt revolver. What kind of power? The girl shook her head. The less you know, the safer you will be. But I will tell you this. It was made by a medicine man who watched his entire family die of white man's diseases. Made in grief and rage, fed with blood and hatred. My grandmother spent 40 years keeping it from being used, keeping it from calling to others who might be tempted by its promises. The sun was setting now, painting the canyon walls the color of fresh blood. In the growing darkness, the bundle in the girl's arms seemed to pulse with its own light, though that might have been a trick of the fading daylight. What's your name? Thorn asked. The girl hesitated. Names had power among her people, and sharing them with strangers was not done lightly. I am called Ayanna. Ayanna. Thorn repeated the name carefully, trying to match her pronunciation. I'm Ezekiel Thorn. Ezekiel. She tested the name on her tongue. In your Bible, was that not the name of a prophet who saw visions of terrible things? You know the Bible? The missionaries came to our territory when I was young. They taught us their stories, thinking we would abandon our own. Instead, we learned that all peoples have tales of spirits and prophecies of power that comes with great cost. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Ayanna tensed, clutching the bundle tighter. They're coming back, she whispered. Who's coming back? The dead ones. The 3 I killed. This thing. She looked down at the cloth bundle. It doesn't just grant power over the living. It calls to those who have crossed over, gives them reason to return. Thorn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. That's impossible. Ayanna's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Is it? Your people have stories too. Stories of things that should not be, of the dead who will not rest. Why should your impossible things be any different from ours? Another howl, closer this time. But coyotes didn't usually hunt in the canyons after dark, and they certainly didn't make sounds like that. The noise was wrong somehow, like a human voice trying to imitate an animal and not quite succeeding. Temperance whinnied and pulled against her reins, rolling her eyes white with fear. Thorn had never seen the mare so spooked, not even during Apache raids or thunderstorms. We need to leave, Ayanna said, rising to her feet in one fluid motion. This place is no longer safe for the living. Where can we go? If what you're saying is true, if that thing calls to the dead, won't they follow us wherever we go? Ayanna's obsidian eyes met his. There is one place they cannot follow. One place where the old powers hold no sway. But it would mean traveling together, and I do not know if you have the stomach for what must be done. The howling came again, and this time there was no mistaking it for any natural animal. It was the sound of rage and hunger, of something that had been denied its rest and wanted vengeance for the interruption. Thorn looked at the Apache girl, at the mysterious bundle she held, at the gathering darkness that seemed to press in around them like living thing. 3 days ago, his biggest worry had been tracking down a band of Mexican raiders. Now he was faced with something that made armed men seem like a minor inconvenience. But he had nowhere else to go, and something about Ayana's quiet desperation touched a part of him he thought had died years ago. Maybe it was the way she held herself, proud even in fear. Maybe it was the weight of responsibility she carried, trying to protect her people from something they couldn't even understand. Or maybe he was just tired of running from things, tired of always being alone with nothing but his horse and his gun and the endless desert horizon. "Tell me what needs to be done," he said. Ayana studied his face in the dying light, as if trying to read his intentions written in the lines around his eyes. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once. "There is a place 3 days' ride from here. A Spanish mission, abandoned during the Indian Wars. The priests consecrated the ground before they fled, and their God's blessing still holds power there. The thing I carry cannot enter such a place, and neither can those it calls back from the dead." "And then what? Do we just wait there until it gets bored and goes away?" Ayana's smile was grim. "No. Then we must find a way to destroy it permanently. But destruction requires knowledge, and knowledge requires—" She paused. "It requires looking upon what should not be seen." The bundle in her arm shifted again, and this time Thorn was certain he saw something move beneath the cloth. Not the restless motion of a living thing, but something worse. Something that suggested the very fabric of the wrapping was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. "Your grandmother warned you against curiosity," Thorn said. "Are you sure you want to ignore that warning?" Ayana's grip on the bundle tightened until her knuckles went white. "I have no choice. If I do not find a way to destroy this thing, it will eventually find its way to someone else. Someone who will not understand the price of using it, who will unleash its power without thought for the consequences." "And you think I can help?" "I think you are a man who has seen darkness before. I think you understand that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice are not the same thing." She was right about that. Thorn had made plenty of choices in his 30 years that weren't safe, weren't smart, weren't profitable. Most of them involved helping people who couldn't help themselves, protecting those who had no one else to protect them. It was a character flaw that had cost him more than one job, more than one friendship, more than one chance at the kind of comfortable life other men seemed to find so easily. The howling came a third time, much closer now. And with it came the sound of something moving through the canyon, something that walked on 2 legs but moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. "We go now," Ayana said, already moving toward Thorn's horse. "Or we do not go at all." Thorn grabbed Temperance's reins and swung up into the saddle. He reached down to help Ayana up behind him, and for a moment their hands touched. Her skin was fever-warm, and he could feel a tremor running through her that had nothing to do with the cold desert night. She settled behind him on the mare, still clutching the cloth bundle to her chest. "Ride north," she said. "Follow the old Spanish trail toward the mountains. And whatever happens, do not let me unwrap this thing again." "What if we don't have a choice?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the sound of Temperance's hooves on stone. "Then we pray that death comes quickly, before we see what we have unleashed upon the world." Thorn spurred Temperance forward, and they rode out of the canyon into the vast emptiness of the New Mexico night. Behind them, the howling grew louder, more insistent, and was joined by other voices. Human voices, but wrong somehow, as if the vocal cords that produced them had been damaged or changed in some fundamental way. The desert at night was a different world than the desert by day. Where the sun revealed endless vistas of sand and stone, the darkness hid everything beyond a few yards in any direction. The moon was only a sliver in the star-filled sky, providing just enough light to follow the old Spanish trail that wound between the scattered mesas and arroyos. Thorne had ridden this country before, during his years as a cavalry scout. He knew the landmarks, the water holes, the places where Apache war parties liked to set their ambushes. But tonight, familiar territory felt alien and threatening. Every shadow might hide something that should not exist. Every sound might herald the approach of things that should have stayed dead. Ayanna sat pressed against his back, the mysterious bundle held between them like a barrier. He could feel the heat radiating from whatever was wrapped in that cloth, could sense the way it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a second heartbeat. Sometimes it grew so warm he thought it might burn through the fabric and sear his skin. Other times it went cold as winter stone, cold enough to make his teeth chatter. They rode for 2 hours before Ayanna spoke again. "Stop here." Thorne reined in Temperance beside a cluster of barrel cacti. The mare was breathing hard, her flanks slick with sweat despite the cool night air. She kept turning her head to look back the way they had come, her ears pricked forward as if listening for pursuit. "We need to rest the horse," Ayanna said, sliding down from the saddle. "And I need to tell you more about what we face." Thorne dismounted and loosened Temperance's girth, letting her drink from his water bag. The horse drank greedily, but she remained tense and alert, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Ayanna found a flat rock and sat down, still cradling the bundle. In the starlight, her face looked carved from the same stone as the desert mesas, all sharp angles and deep shadows. "My grandmother's name was Nasha," she began. "She was born in the time when the Apache were still free, when we could follow the seasons and the herds without white men's fences to stop us. She learned the old medicine from her grandmother and her grandmother before that in an unbroken line stretching back to the first days." Thorne settled on a rock across from her, keeping his rifle across his knees. "What kind of medicine?" "All kinds. Healing medicine for the body, protection medicine for the spirit, war medicine for times when fighting could not be avoided, but also the dark medicine, the forbidden knowledge that was sometimes necessary to preserve the people." The bundle in her arms pulsed once, strongly enough that Thorne could see the cloth expand and contract. Ayanna winced as if it had caused her physical pain. 50 years ago, when I was not yet born, a sickness came to our band. Not the white man's diseases that killed so many of our people, but something else. Something that made the dead walk among the living, made them hunger for the flesh of those they had loved in life. Thorne felt his blood turn to ice water. "Wendigo?" Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. "You know of such things?" "I spent time in Canada, trapping beaver in the Northern Territories. The Cree told stories about creatures that were once human, turned into monsters by cannibalism and dark magic. They said the Wendigo could possess the living, make them crave human flesh until they became monsters themselves." "Not Wendigo," Ayanna said, "but something similar. The medicine man who created this ... She gestured to the bundle. "His name was Tarak. He had seen his wife and children consumed by the walking dead, had watched them rise again as creatures of hunger and rage. In his grief and anger, he worked a great medicine, a binding that would give him power over death itself." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded Thorne of old battlefields and mass graves. Temperance snorted and moved closer to them, seeking the comfort of human presence. "Tarak's medicine worked," Ayanna continued. "He could command the dead, could force them to do his bidding. He used them to hunt down the creatures that had killed his family, used them to cleanse the sickness from our people. But the power consumed him. He began to see enemies everywhere, began to use his dead servants for revenge instead of protection." "What happened to him?" "My great-grandmother killed him, but she could not bring herself to destroy the thing he had created. She said it might be needed again someday, when the people faced extinction and had no other choice. So she bound it with ceremonies and blood sacrifice, wrapped it in blessed cloth, and hid it away. The bundle pulsed again, stronger this time. The cloth began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, like foxfire or swamp gas. Ayanna pressed it closer to her chest, and the glow dimmed but did not disappear entirely. Every generation, one woman in our family was chosen to guard it, to keep it safe, to resist the temptation to use it, to pass it on when death came calling. My grandmother carried this burden for 40 years. She never once unwrapped it, never once gave in to curiosity about what lay beneath the cloth. But you did. Ayanna's laugh was bitter. Not by choice. The Comancheros who attacked our camp, they were not ordinary raiders. Their leader, Santos Morales, he had learned of the bundle's existence somehow. He came seeking it specifically, willing to kill anyone who stood in his way. Thorne's attention sharpened. He had been hunting Santos Morales for months, following a trail of burned homesteads and murdered families across 3 territories. The Mexican bandit was wanted by both American and Mexican authorities, with a bounty high enough to set a man up for life. Morales was there. He led the attack personally. When his men had killed the elders and scattered the surviving families, he came to my grandmother's lodge. He demanded she give him the bundle, threatened to torture the children if she refused. Ayanna's voice grew quiet, distant. My grandmother was dying already. The coughing sickness had been eating her lungs for months, but she was still strong enough to spit in Morales' face, strong enough to curse him in the old language. So he shot her, right there in front of me. The bundle began to writhe in her arms like a living thing. The glow grew brighter, and Thorne could swear he heard voices whispering from within the cloth, speaking in a language that predated human speech. I grabbed the bundle and ran, Ayanna continued. Morales sent 3 of his best men after me. They cornered me in the canyon where you found me, thought a young Apache woman would be easy prey. But I was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. You unwrapped it, only partially. Just enough to see what lay beneath the first layer of cloth, just enough to touch it with my bare skin. She shuddered. The moment I made contact, I could feel every death within 100 miles. Every human who had died violently, every animal that had been killed in anger or fear. And I could call them back, could give them form and purpose and a terrible hunger for vengeance. Thorne tried to imagine what that must have felt like, to suddenly have the power to command the dead. The very idea made him dizzy with horror and a strange, shameful excitement. The 3 Comancheros died quickly, Ayanna said. The dead I called were not gentle with them. But once the killing was done, once my anger had been satisfied, the dead did not simply disappear. They lingered, growing stronger, more solid, and they began to hunger for more than just vengeance. A coyote yipped somewhere in the darkness, and both Thorne and Ayanna tensed. But this time it sounded like a natural animal, not the twisted mockery they had heard in the canyon. That's why we must reach the mission, Ayanna said. Consecrated ground will weaken the bundle's power, will give us time to figure out how to destroy it permanently. But the journey is dangerous. Every mile we travel, every hour that passes, the dead grow stronger and more numerous. How many are there? I don't know. When I wrapped the bundle again, I lost the ability to sense them directly. But they are following us, and they are calling to others. By dawn, there could be dozens. By tomorrow night, perhaps hundreds. Thorne looked back the way they had come, half expecting to see a horde of shambling corpses stumbling through the desert toward them. But there was only darkness and the distant howl of wind through stone. Why hasn't this happened before? He asked. If your people have been guarding this thing for 50 years, surely someone must have been tempted to use it. My grandmother told me that her grandmother did use it once, during the worst years of the war with Mexico. Mexican soldiers had captured a group of our children, were planning to sell them as slaves. She unwrapped the bundle and sent the dead against them. Ayanna paused, lost in memory. She said the screaming lasted for 3 days. When it was over, every Mexican within 50 miles was dead, including the children she had tried to save. The dead cannot tell friend from enemy. cannot distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. They know only hunger and the desire to drag the living down into darkness with them. The wind died away to nothing, leaving them in perfect silence. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if the desert itself was listening to their conversation. "There's something else," Ayanna said after a long moment. "Something my grandmother never told me until she was dying. The bundle doesn't just call to those who have died recently. It calls to all the dead, going back generations. And some of those dead were medicine men themselves, powerful spirits who have been waiting in the darkness for someone to give them form again. Meaning? Meaning that if we cannot destroy this thing before it reaches full power, we will not just be facing mindless corpses. We will be facing the risen spirits of Apache shamans, Mexican brujos, white men's priests, and soldiers and outlaws. Every person of power who has died in this desert over the past century, all united in their hunger to return to the world of the living." Thorn felt as if someone had poured cold water down his spine. "And you think a Spanish mission will protect us from something like that? I hope so. The priests who built that mission were not ordinary men. They were members of a special order sent to the New World specifically to combat the dark spirits they knew they would find here. They understood that the native peoples had their own powers, their own ways of touching the supernatural world." She shifted the bundle to her other arm, wincing as if it had grown heavier. The mission was built on a site the Apache considered sacred, a place where the spirits of the ancestors were said to rest. Instead of driving out our spirits, the priests found a way to work with them, to create a sanctuary where the living and the dead could coexist in peace. What happened to the priests? They fled when the Apache Wars began, but they left certain protections in place. Sacred symbols carved into the walls, relics blessed by their pope, rituals that renew themselves with each sunrise. My grandmother visited the mission once when she was young. She said it felt like stepping into another world, a place where the normal rules of life and death did not apply. Thorn stood and walked to where Temperance stood cropping at sparse desert grass. The Mari's nervousness had eased somewhat, though she still kept one eye on the darkness behind them. How far to this mission? 2 days if we push hard and don't run into trouble. But double quotes Ayanna hesitated. There is something you should know before we continue. The journey will not be easy for either of us. The bundle's influence grows stronger the longer I carry it, and it affects those who travel with me as well. What kind of effects? You will see things that are not there, hear voices of people long dead. You will feel the pull of the grave, the desire to lie down in the sand and let the desert claim you. And you will be tempted to look upon what lies beneath the cloth, to satisfy your curiosity no matter what the cost. Thorn considered this. He had faced death before, had stared down armed men and wild animals and the pitiless indifference of the desert itself. But this was different. This was a threat to his very soul, a challenge to everything he thought he knew about the nature of existence. But he had given his word, and a man's word was all he really owned in this harsh country. Besides, the alternative was to abandon Ayanna to face this horror alone, and that was something he could not do. "I'll manage," he said. Ayanna studied his face in the starlight. "You are a strange man, Ezekiel Thorn. Most white men would have ridden away by now, would have told themselves this was not their problem. Maybe, but I've never been accused of being like most men. Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, and one Thorn wasn't sure he could answer honestly. Part of it was simple decency, the inability to abandon someone in need. Part of it was professional interest, the fact that Santos Morales was somehow connected to all this. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way Ayanna held herself, proud even in desperation. Maybe it was the weight of responsibility she carried, trying to protect her people from something they couldn't understand. Or maybe he was just tired of being alone, tired of having no one to depend on but himself. "I guess I'm curious to see how this story ends," he said finally. Ayanna's smile was sad and knowing. Curiosity. My grandmother always said it would be the death of us all. She stood and walked toward Temperance. We should go. The dead travel faster at night when the boundary between their world and ours grows thin. Thorn helped her back into the saddle and they resumed their journey north. The old Spanish trail wound between towering rock formations that loomed like sleeping giants in the darkness. Somewhere an owl called, its voice echoing off the canyon walls with an almost human quality. As they rode, Thorn became aware of subtle changes in the world around them. The stars seemed dimmer than they should be, as if something was filtering the light from above. The air grew thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. And always there was the sound of something following them, something that matched their pace but never quite caught up. Twice, Temperance shied at things Thorn couldn't see, forcing him to fight to keep her under control. The second time, Ayanna leaned forward and whispered something in Apache into the mare's ear. Whatever she said calmed the horse immediately, but left Thorn wondering what his mount had seen that his human eyes had missed. They paused at midnight to rest Temperance and share water and jerked beef from Thorn's saddlebags. The bundle in Ayanna's arms had grown noticeably warmer, and its glow was now visible even in full darkness. Worse, it had begun to make sounds, soft whispers and sighs that seemed to come from multiple voices speaking at once. "It's getting stronger," Ayanna said, stating the obvious. "Can you rewrap it? Add more layers of cloth?" "I've tried. But each time I touch the wrapping, it burns my hands. Look." She held up her palms in the dim light, showing angry red welts across her fingers and palms. Thorn reached for his canteen. "Here, let me." "No." Ayanna pulled her hands back. "Water will not heal these wounds. They are spiritual injuries, marks left by contact with power too great for mortal flesh to bear. They will heal only when the bundle is destroyed or when I am dead." The casual way she mentioned death sent a chill through Thorn. "You're not planning to die on me, are you?" "I am planning to do whatever is necessary to keep this thing from falling into the wrong hands. If that means my death, so be it. And if we can't destroy it? If this mission doesn't provide the answers we need?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then I will walk into the deepest part of the desert and unwrap the bundle completely. I will let its power consume me. Let it turn me into something that can no longer threaten the living. It is not a good death, but it may be the only way to protect my people." Thorn wanted to argue, wanted to tell her there had to be another way. But the bundle chose that moment to pulse with brilliant light, illuminating the entire clearing in phosphorescent green radiance. For just an instant, Thorn could swear he saw shapes moving in that light, human figures made of mist and shadow reaching toward them with grasping hands. Then the light faded, leaving them in darkness that seemed absolute after the sudden brightness. "We need to keep moving," Ayanna said, already rising to her feet. "They're getting closer." They rode through the rest of the night without stopping, following the ancient trail that Spanish conquistadors had carved through the desert centuries before. The path wound between towering mesas and through narrow arroyos where flash floods had carved deep channels in the red earth. In daylight, it would have been beautiful country, the kind of landscape that made men understand why the Apache fought so hard to keep it. But in the pre-dawn darkness, with the bundle's eldritch glow casting twisted shadows on the canyon walls, it felt like riding through the antechamber of hell. Thorn had been in the saddle for nearly 18 hours straight, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. His eyes burned from staring into the darkness. His back ached from Ayanna's weight pressed against him, and his gun hand had developed a persistent tremor that made him worry about his ability to shoot straight if the need arose. Worse than the physical fatigue was the mental strain. The bundle's influence was growing stronger by the hour, just as Ayanna had warned. He found himself hearing voices in the wind, seeing movement in his peripheral vision that vanished when he turned to look directly. Twice he had almost drawn his Colt on shadows that turned out to be nothing more than oddly shaped rocks or twisted Joshua trees. Ayana seemed to be suffering even more than he was. She had grown pale and drawn, her breathing shallow and labored. The burns on her hands from contact with the bundle had spread up her arms, leaving angry red welts that looked like ritual scarification, and her eyes. Her eyes had begun to reflect the bundle's phosphorescent glow, as if the thing was somehow taking root inside her soul. How much further? Thorn asked as they paused to rest Temperance beside a natural spring that bubbled up from between two massive boulders. Ayana looked up at the stars, calculating their position with the instinctive navigation skills of her people. We've made good time. Another day's hard riding should bring us to the Mission Valley. And if we don't make it, if whatever's following us catches up before we reach consecrated ground? Ayana's smile was ghostly in the starlight. Then we discover whether the stories about what happens after death are true or not. Thorn let Temperance drink from the spring while he refilled their water bags. The horse was holding up well, but he could see the strain in her eyes, the way her ears kept swiveling toward sounds only she could hear. Animals were more sensitive to supernatural influences than humans, and Temperance was clearly picking up things that her rider's duller senses were missing. "Tell me about this mission," Thorn said. "What exactly are we walking into?" "Mission Santa Esperanza," Ayana replied. "Built in 1762 by Franciscan monks who came north from Mexico City. They were not ordinary priests, as I said. They were members of an order founded specifically to combat supernatural threats in the New World." She paused to take a careful sip from her water bag, wincing as the liquid touched her cracked lips. The Spanish had learned, during their conquest of the Aztec Empire, that the natives of this continent possessed forms of magic unknown in Europe. Some of it was benign, even helpful, but some of it was dangerous beyond imagining, like the bundle you're carrying. Exactly. The church decided that rather than simply trying to destroy all native spiritual practices, they would study them, learn to recognize the truly dangerous ones, and develop countermeasures. The monks who built Santa Esperanza were part of that effort. A bat fluttered overhead, its wings nearly silent against the star-filled sky. But something about its flight pattern seemed wrong to Thorn, too purposeful, too direct. He watched it disappear into the darkness and wondered if it had been a natural creature at all. "The mission was successful for 20 years, Ayana continued. "The monks learned to work with local Apache shamans, sharing knowledge about ways to combat dark spirits and malevolent magic. They even intermarried with our people, creating a unique blend of Christian and Apache spiritual traditions." "What happened?" "Politics. The Mexican government decided that the missions were becoming too independent, too willing to protect Apache interests against white expansion. In 1784, they ordered all the priests to return to Mexico City or face excommunication." Ayana shifted the bundle to her other arm, and Thorn noticed that it had grown visibly larger since they began their journey. Whatever was wrapped inside that cloth was expanding, growing stronger with each passing hour. "Most of the priests obeyed the order," she said, "but 3 of them remained behind, choosing exile over abandoning their Apache converts. They performed a final ceremony, consecrating not just the mission building but the entire valley, creating a sanctuary where the forces of darkness could not enter. And then, they were never seen again. Some say they died of old age, protected by their own magic until the end. Others believe they transcended mortality entirely, becoming guardian spirits of the place they had sworn to protect." Thorn helped Ayana back into the saddle, and they resumed their journey. The trail began to climb now, winding up into the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The air grew thinner and cooler, carrying the scent of pine trees and mountain streams. But it also carried something else, something that made Thorn's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. It was the smell of decay, of things long dead and improperly buried. And it was getting stronger. "They're close," Ayana whispered, echoing his thoughts. "How many? I can't tell." The bundle's influence makes it hard to sense individual spirits. but many. More than when we started." As if in response to her words, a sound echoed through the canyon behind them. It was not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something that combined the worst elements of both. It was the sound of hunger and rage and desperate longing, of creatures that had been denied their rest and wanted nothing more than to drag the living down into darkness with them. The sound was answered from ahead of them and to both sides. They were being surrounded. Temperance began to prance and rear, her eyes rolling white with terror. Thorn fought to keep her under control, but the Mare's panic was infectious. His own heart began to race. His breathing became quick and shallow. "Easy, girl," he murmured, leaning forward to stroke the horse's neck. "Easy now." But even as he tried to calm Temperance, Thorn could feel his own resolve beginning to crack. The bundle's influence was growing stronger by the minute, filling his mind with whispers and suggestions, with promises of power and threats of damnation. "Just take a look," the voices seemed to say. "One quick peek beneath the cloth. What harm could it do? You could save her," other voices whispered. "Use the power, command the dead, protect the woman you're beginning to care about. She's dying anyway," a third set of voices pointed out with cruel logic. "The bundle is killing her slowly, burning her from the inside out. At least if you take it from her, her death will serve a purpose." Thorn shook his head violently, trying to clear the intrusive thoughts. But they kept coming, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. "Don't listen to them," Ayanna said, as if she could hear the voices too. "They lie. They promise everything and deliver only death and madness." "How do you resist it?" "I think about my people, about the children who will die if this thing is ever used again, about my grandmother who spent 40 years carrying this burden so that others wouldn't have to." Another howl echoed through the canyon, much closer this time, and with it came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, moving through the desert with unnatural coordination. "There," Ayanna pointed ahead to where the trail crested a low ridge. "Once we reach the top, we should be able to see the Mission Valley." Thorn spurred Temperance up the steep rocky path, the Mare's hooves striking sparks from the stone. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more frantic, as if whatever was following them sensed that their quarry was about to escape. They reached the crest of the ridge just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hint of dawn. Spread out below them was a broad valley, its floor dotted with the ruins of what had once been a thriving settlement. At the valley's heart stood the mission itself, its bell tower still intact despite more than 40 years of abandonment. But what caught Thorn's attention was not the building itself, but the way the morning light seemed to behave around it. The dawn illuminated everything else in the valley with normal golden radiance, but the mission and the ground immediately around it glowed with a different quality of light entirely. It was brighter, cleaner, somehow more real than the ordinary sunlight that touched the rest of the landscape. "Sacred ground," Ayanna breathed. "The consecration still holds." They began the descent into the valley, Temperance picking her way carefully down the treacherous slope. Behind them, the howling had stopped abruptly, replaced by a frustrated keening that raised the hair on Thorn's neck. "Why did they stop?" he asked. "Daylight weakens them," Ayanna replied, "and they can sense the consecrated ground ahead. They know they cannot follow us there. For how long? Until sunset. Maybe longer if the blessing is strong enough. But eventually, they will find a way through." The bundle's power grows stronger by the hour, and even holy ground has its limits. They reached the valley floor as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, flooding the landscape with warm golden light. The mission stood perhaps half a mile away across flat, sandy ground dotted with the remnants of what had once been cultivated fields. As they drew closer, Thorn could see that the building was in remarkable condition for something that had been abandoned for decades. The adobe walls showed little sign of weather damage. The wooden doors and window shutters looked solid and well-maintained. Even the bell that hung in the tower appeared to be free of rust or corrosion. "It's like time stopped here," he murmured. "Perhaps it did," Ayanna replied. The priests who consecrated this place were dealing with forces beyond normal understanding. Who knows what other protections they might have woven into the very stones. They reached the mission's main entrance just as the sun reached its full morning strength. The massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if inviting weary travelers to enter and find sanctuary. Thorn dismounted and helped Ayanna down from the saddle. The moment her feet touched the consecrated ground, she gasped and nearly collapsed. The bundle in her arms flared with brilliant light, then went completely dark for the first time since Thorn had met her. "It's fighting the blessing," she said, her voice strained with pain. "The two powers are in conflict. Is that good or bad? I don't know. But at least here we have time to think, time to plan. The dead cannot cross onto holy ground, and the bundle's influence is ... muted." They led Temperance through the mission's gates and into a courtyard that had once been a garden. Fruit trees still grew here, heavy with oranges and pomegranates despite having no one to tend them. A fountain in the center of the space bubbled with clear, sweet water that tasted like it had been blessed by angels themselves. The mission's interior was even more remarkable than its exterior. The main chapel had been built in the traditional cruciform style, with a high vaulted ceiling and walls decorated with elaborate frescoes depicting scenes from both Christian scripture and Apache mythology. Saints and warriors shared space with thunderbirds and spirit animals, creating a unique synthesis of two very different spiritual traditions. But what truly caught Thorn's attention was the altar at the far end of the chapel. It had been carved from a single piece of black obsidian, the volcanic glass polished to mirror brightness. And embedded in its surface were symbols he had never seen before, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. Apache or Spanish? He asked, nodding toward the strange markings. "Both," Ayanna replied, "and neither. The priests who built this place created something entirely new, a form of protection that drew power from multiple sources." She approached the altar carefully, still clutching the bundle to her chest. As she drew near, the obsidian began to glow with soft white radiance, and the symbols became clearer, more defined. "It's responding to the bundle," she said. The altar was designed to contain dangerous artifacts, to neutralize their power without destroying them. "So we just put the bundle on the altar and walk away?" Ayanna's laugh was bitter. "If only it were that simple. No, the altar can only contain the bundle temporarily. To destroy it permanently, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She looked at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow and determination. "Which means eventually, we're going to have to unwrap it completely and look upon what lies beneath the cloth." Thorn felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Your grandmother warned you against curiosity, and now I understand why. But some knowledge, no matter how dangerous, is necessary for survival." Outside, storm clouds were gathering despite the clear morning sky they had ridden under. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the chapel windows. "It's going to be a long day," Ayanna said, settling down on one of the wooden pews that lined the chapel nave. "And an even longer night." Thorn took a seat across the aisle from her, his rifle across his knees. Through the stained glass windows, he could see shapes moving in the growing darkness of the storm. Shapes that walked upright but moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of things that had forgotten how to be human. The dead had found them. Now it was just a matter of whether the mission's protections would be enough to keep them out, and whether Thorn and Ayanna would have the courage to do what needed to be done. When the time came to unwrap the bundle and face whatever horrors lay within, the storm that had begun as scattered drops became a deluge by midday, turning the mission courtyard into a shallow lake and drumming against the chapel roof with the fury of 10,000 angry spirits. But it was not natural weather that battered the ancient walls. This was something else entirely, something that carried the weight of supernatural rage and frustrated hunger. Through the stained glass windows, Thorn could see them clearly now. Dozens of figures moved through the driving rain, circling the mission like wolves around a campfire. They maintained their distance from the consecrated ground, but their presence was a constant reminder that sanctuary was temporary at best. Some of the dead looked almost human, recent victims of violence who had retained much of their original appearance. Others were little more than animated skeletons held together by malevolent will and strips of desiccated flesh. But the worst were those that had been changed by their time in the grave, twisted into forms that bore only passing resemblance to what they had been in life. Ayanna sat motionless on the front pew, the bundle resting in her lap like a sleeping child. The cloth wrapping had grown noticeably thicker over the past few hours, as if additional layers were materializing around whatever lay within. But rather than muffling the thing's power, the extra wrapping seemed to be concentrating it, building pressure like water behind a dam. "How long do we have?" Thorn asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Until nightfall," Ayanna replied without looking up. "Maybe less. The bundle is feeding on the storm, drawing power from the violence in the air. And the longer we wait, the stronger it becomes. And the stronger it becomes, the more likely it is to break through the mission's protections." "Exactly." Thorn walked to one of the windows and peered out through the colored glass. The rain had intensified to the point where he could barely see the mission walls, but the shapes moving beyond them were unmistakable. More dead were arriving by the hour, drawn by the bundle's call like iron filings to a lodestone. "There's something I don't understand," he said. "If this thing is so dangerous, if using it means calling up every corpse for miles around, why would anyone want it? What good is a weapon you can't control?" Ayanna's laugh was hollow. "You're thinking like a white man, thinking about practical applications and measured responses. But the medicine man who created this bundle was not thinking practically. He was thinking about grief, about rage, about the need to make someone pay for what had been taken from him." She lifted the bundle slightly, wincing as her burned hands made contact with the cloth. Tarek didn't care about controlling the dead. He wanted them to be as angry as he was, as hungry for vengeance. He wanted to unleash chaos and destruction on a world that had taken everything he loved. And someone like Santos Morales would see that as useful. Morales is a man who burns homesteads for pleasure, who kills children to make their parents suffer. Yes, he would find great use for a weapon that could turn entire territories into graveyards. A flash of lightning illuminated the chapel, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mission. In that brief moment of brilliance, Thorn saw something that made his blood turn cold. The shapes circling the mission were no longer maintaining their respectful distance from the consecrated ground. They were testing the boundaries, reaching out with skeletal fingers to touch the invisible barrier that held them back. And where they touched, sparks of dark energy danced between their fingertips and the holy protection. "They're probing for weaknesses," he said. Ayanna nodded grimly. "The bundle's power is growing exponentially. Soon it will be strong enough to overwhelm even blessed ground. Then we need to act now, before it's too late." "Yes. But first, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." She stood and walked to the obsidian altar, the bundle held before her like an offering. As she approached, the volcanic glass began to glow more brightly, and the strange symbols carved into its surface pulsed with rhythmic light. "My grandmother told me the full story only once on the night before she died. She made me swear never to repeat it, never to share the knowledge with anyone else. But circumstances have changed." Ayanna placed the bundle on the altar's surface. The moment it made contact with the obsidian, both the cloth and the stone erupted in blinding radiance. The light was painful to look at directly, but within its depths, Thorn could see shapes moving, figures that seemed to be made of shadow and malevolence. "Tarek was not just any medicine man," Ayanna continued, her voice barely audible over the growing wind outside. "He was what my people call a skinwalker, a shaman who had learned to take on the forms of animals, to walk between the world of the living and the realm of the dead." Thorn had heard whispers of skinwalkers during his time as a cavalry scout, Stories told around campfires by Apache guides who would not meet his eyes as they spoke. According to legend, they were the most powerful and most feared of all native medicine workers, capable of feats that bordered on the miraculous. But skinwalkers were also forbidden, Ayanna said. The power they wielded came with a terrible price. To gain the ability to shapeshift, they had to commit acts of profound evil, had to sacrifice their own humanity piece by piece until nothing remained but hunger and the desire for power. The bundle pulsed again, and this time Thorn was certain he heard voices emanating from within the cloth. Not whispers or suggestions, but actual words spoken in a dozen different languages, all of them filled with rage and pain and an overwhelming desire for revenge. When Tarak's family died, he was already walking the dark path, Ayanna continued, but their deaths pushed him over the edge completely. He performed a ritual that had been forbidden for generations, a ceremony that required him to sacrifice not just his own soul, but the souls of others as well. What kind of ritual? He gathered 13 of the most powerful medicine men from tribes across the territory. He told them he had discovered a way to combine their abilities, to create a weapon that could drive the white man from Apache lands forever. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Thorn saw that the dead outside had grown bolder. They were pressed against the mission walls now, their decaying faces turned toward the chapel where the bundle rested on its altar. The other medicine men agreed to participate, Ayanna said. They were desperate, you see. The white man's diseases had decimated their people. The cavalry had scattered their bands. Their way of life was disappearing before their eyes. They were willing to try anything that might restore the balance. But it was a trap. Of course, Tarak had no intention of sharing power or working for the common good. The ritual he performed was designed not to combine their abilities, but to steal them. One by one, he murdered the other medicine men, taking their power into himself as they died. The bundle began to vibrate on the altar, the cloth wrapping undulating like a living thing. The voices within grew louder, more distinct, and Thorn realized with growing horror that he was listening to the death cries of 13 powerful shamans, trapped forever within Tarak's creation. But power stolen through murder carries its own curse, Ayanna said. Tarak found that he could not control what he had created. The souls of the murdered medicine men were bound to the bundle, but they retained their intelligence, their will, their desire for vengeance. They turned the bundle's power against him, drove him mad with visions and whispers and the constant pressure of their collective hatred. Is that why your great-grandmother was able to kill him? She didn't kill him. Not exactly. Ayanna reached toward the bundle, then pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. The souls trapped within the bundle drove Tarak to destroy himself. They made him see visions of his dead family, convinced him that they were calling to him from beyond the grave. In his madness, he walked into the desert during the hottest part of summer, with no water, no food, no protection from the sun. But the bundle survived. The bundle contains their souls. As long as it exists, they cannot pass on to whatever comes after death. They are trapped in a state of perpetual suffering, unable to find peace, unable to rest. Another flash of lightning, followed by thunder so loud it seemed to shake dust from the mission rafters. And in that moment of illumination, Thorn saw something that chilled him to the bone. One of the dead had crossed the threshold. It stood in the mission doorway, its skeletal frame draped in the remnants of a Mexican cavalry uniform. Its empty eye sockets were filled with the same phosphorescent glow that emanated from the bundle, and when it opened its mouth, the voice that emerged was like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "The barriers weaken," it said in Spanish-accented English. "Soon, we will reclaim what was stolen from us." The figure raised one bony hand, and the bundle on the altar responded by flaring with brilliant light. The cloth wrapping began to smolder and char at the edges, as if it were being consumed by invisible flames. "No," Ayanna breathed. "It's too soon. We're not ready." But the bundle had reached some critical threshold. The cloth wrapping, which had contained its power for 50 years, was finally giving way under the pressure. Layer after layer peeled away like burning paper, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. Thorn caught sight of carved bone, of metal that gleamed with unnatural light, of something that might once have been human skin, but had been preserved and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And woven through it all were strands of what looked like hair, but hair that moved on its own, reaching out like questing tentacles toward any source of warmth or life. "Don't look at it directly," Ayanna warned, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. "The moment you see it clearly, it will have power over you." But it was already too late. The bundle's influence was spreading through the chapel like ripples on a pond, affecting everything it touched. The frescoes on the walls began to shift and change, depicting scenes of violence and death instead of religious salvation. The wooden pews creaked and groaned as if they were in pain. Even the air itself seemed to grow thick and oppressive, filled with the weight of accumulated suffering. The skeletal figure in the doorway took another step into the chapel, and as it did, more dead appeared behind it. They filed in with military precision, their empty eyes fixed on the bundle that called to them with promises of renewed life and eternal vengeance. "We have to destroy it now," Thorn said, drawing his Colt and aiming at the bundle, "before it breaks free completely." "No," Ayanna threw herself between him and the altar. "Bullets can't hurt it. Physical force will only make it stronger." "Then what do we do?" "We have to complete the ritual. We have to do what my grandmother and her grandmother before her could not bring themselves to do." "Which is?" Ayanna's obsidian eyes met his, and in their depths he saw a terrible resolve. "We have to unwrap it completely. We have to look upon the full extent of what Tarek created. And then we have to find a way to free the souls trapped within." The dead were filling the chapel now, rank upon rank of skeletal warriors and decaying spirits. But they made no move to attack, seemed content to simply watch as the bundle continued its transformation on the altar. "They're waiting," Thorn realized, "waiting for it to fully manifest. When it does, when the last of the wrapping burns away, they will be free to act as they choose. Free to serve the one who commands the bundle, or free to take revenge on everyone responsible for their current state, including us, especially us." The bundle gave one final violent pulse, and the last of the cloth wrapping fell away like shed skin. What lay revealed on the obsidian altar was unlike anything Thorn had ever seen or imagined. It was roughly the size and shape of a human heart, but it had been fashioned from materials that should not exist in the natural world. Bone and metal and preserved flesh had been woven together with strands of silver and gold, creating a structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. At its center was a cavity filled with what looked like liquid light, and floating within that radiance were 13 small objects that pulsed with their own inner fire. The souls of the murdered medicine men, trapped forever in their crystallized essence. The moment the bundle was fully revealed, the temperature in the chapel plummeted. Frost began to form on the windows, and their breath came out in visible puffs. The dead standing in the nave began to move, no longer content to simply observe. But something else was happening as well. The symbols carved into the obsidian altar were glowing brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the bundle's malevolent heartbeat. And from somewhere deep within the mission's foundations came the sound of chanting, voices raised in prayer that had been ongoing for more than 40 years. "The priests," Ayanna whispered, "they didn't die. They're still here, still maintaining the consecration." The ghostly chanting grew louder, and the dead advancing through the chapel began to slow, as if they were walking through thick honey. The bundle itself seemed to writhe on the altar, fighting against the renewed strength of the mission's protections. "This is our chance," Ayanna said. "While the priest's prayers hold them back, while the consecration is at its strongest." She reached toward the bundle with her burned hands, ignoring the way her flesh sizzled and smoked at its proximity. "I have to touch it directly, have to make contact with the souls trapped inside. It's the only way to free them." That'll kill you. Probably, but it's the only way. Thorn grabbed her wrist, stopping her just short of touching the terrible artifact. There has to be another way. There is no other way. This is what I was born for, what my family has been preparing for over 3 generations. The bundle can only be destroyed by someone willing to sacrifice themselves to free the souls within. Then let me do it. Ayanna shook her head. You don't have the bloodline, don't carry the necessary spiritual preparation. It has to be me. The dead were moving again, fighting against the priest's prayers through sheer force of will. The skeletal figure in the cavalry uniform had drawn a rusted saber and was advancing on the altar with murderous intent. Do it now, Thorn said, positioning himself between Ayanna and the approaching dead. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Ayanna nodded and reached out with both hands, pressing her palms against the bundle's crystalline surface. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Light erupted from the point of contact. Not the sickly phosphorescence that had emanated from the bundle before, but clean, pure radiance that filled every corner of the chapel. The dead shrieked and recoiled, their forms beginning to waver and fade in the face of that overwhelming brightness. But Ayanna was screaming too, her body convulsing as the bundle's power coursed through her. Her hands were no longer just burned but actually beginning to dissolve, the flesh stripped away layer by layer as she maintained her grip on the artifact. Through the light, Thorn could see shapes beginning to emerge from the bundle's core. 13 figures, translucent and shimmering, but unmistakably human. The souls of the murdered medicine men, finally free after 50 years of torment. They looked around the chapel with expressions of wonder and relief, as if they had awakened from the most terrible nightmare imaginable. One of them, an elderly Apache with kind eyes and silver hair, approached Ayanna where she knelt beside the altar. "Child," he said in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, "you have given us the greatest gift possible. We are in your debt." "Free them," Ayanna gasped, nodding toward the dead who still pressed against the chapel's walls. "Free them all." The old medicine man nodded and gestured to his companions. The 13 souls spread out through the chapel, each one approaching different groups of the dead. As they touched the skeletal warriors and decaying spirits, those creatures began to change, their forms becoming more solid, more human. The phosphorescent glow faded from their empty eye sockets, replaced by expressions of confusion and dawning awareness. They looked around as if seeing their surroundings for the first time, no longer driven by supernatural hunger, but simply lost and far from home. "Go in peace," the old medicine man told them. "Your battles are over. Rest now and be at rest." One by one, the dead began to fade away, their forms becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But these were not the violent dissolution of destroyed spirits. These were the gentle passings of souls finally allowed to find their rest. The bundle on the altar was changing too. The crystalline structure was cracking and crumbling, the liquid light at its center growing dimmer with each passing moment. As the last of the trapped souls was released, the artifact simply stopped existing. Not destroyed in any violent fashion, but simply returning to the nothingness from which it had been born. Ayanna collapsed beside the altar, her hands completely gone, her arms burned to the bone nearly to her elbows. But she was smiling, and in her obsidian eyes was a peace that Thorn had never seen before. "Is it over?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "It's over," she confirmed. "The souls are free. The bundle is destroyed and the dead can finally rest. And you?" Ayanna's smile grew sadder. "I won't be long behind them. The bundle's power has burned through me, consumed everything that kept me anchored to life. But that's all right. I fulfilled my purpose, completed the task my family has carried for 3 generations." Thorn wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that there had to be some way to save her. But even as he watched, her form was beginning to grow translucent, following the same path as the soul she had helped to free. "Will you do something for me?" she asked. "Anything. Find my people. Tell them what happened here. Tell them that the burden has been lifted from our family. And tell them—" She paused, her voice growing weaker. "Tell them that some prices are worth paying if they purchase freedom for others." "I will. Thank you, Ezekiel Thorne, for everything." And then she was gone, fading away like morning mist before the sun. Thorne was alone in the chapel, surrounded by the echoes of prayers and the lingering scent of sage smoke. Outside, the storm had passed. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel walls in brilliant colors. The mission was quiet now, peaceful in a way it had not been for decades. Thorne gathered his few possessions and walked out into the courtyard where Temperance waited patiently by the fountain. The mare seemed calmer now, no longer nervous or afraid. Whatever supernatural influences had plagued this place were truly gone. He mounted up and rode out of the Mission Valley, following the old Spanish trail back toward the world of the living. He had promises to keep, stories to tell, and somewhere out there, Santos Morales was still alive and still dangerous. But as he rode, Thorne found himself thinking not about bounties or vengeance, but about a young Apache woman who had sacrificed everything to free the souls of strangers, who had chosen duty over safety and service over survival. The desert stretched out before him, vast and empty and full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, Ezekiel Thorne was not riding away from something, but toward it. Behind him, the mission bell began to toll, ringing out across the valley in celebration of souls finally granted their rest. The sound followed him for miles, a reminder that some stories, no matter how dark they begin, can still find their way to redemption in the end.